Hello and welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and on this week's crossover with Bob Murphy, we demonstrate that we can't be told what to cover because of what's popular on social media or X. Gosh darn it, we're going to talk about things that we think are important. And so this week, what we decided to cover was the thorny issue for libertarian theory of what to do about children. What are parental rights? What are children's rights? How do we deal with it in problems or in situations where there's a problem or a conflict? Ordinarily there isn't, but sometimes there is, and that can be really abusive. And how would a free market without any course of government handle situations like that? And how would we handle it in situations where our AI becomes conscious? How would we treat situations like that, or aliens that were sentient if we were to discover them? And then also because they're related, we talk about what is the relationship between humans and the animals that they own, either pets or livestock or what have you. What again is the libertarian framework for these issues? How should we think about them? Do our laws and our intuitions match? Should they? It's pretty interesting, so please enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
How are we doing this week? What's on your mind? What are you obsessing over?
Well, as you and I both know, and we'll let the audience in on the secret, we were deciding what are we going to talk about this week, and we absolutely said unless a suitcase nuke has gone off in Tehran, we're not talking about that stuff. And Adam, you said something about joking about kittens, I think, and then I said, well, we could link it to how can you? What's the libertarian take on? You can own your kitten, but you can't. What framework would allow you to say you're the owner of your kittens, but you're not the owner of your 6-month-old child? And then, all things, and then we were bandying that back and realized, no, this actually is something we should talk about. So, folks, what we are talking about is in a libertarian type world, or as I like to call it, a free society, where there's, voluntary contract, things are, the default from institutions is to engage in voluntary arrangements and so forth. In that kind of an approach, how do you deal with things like parents and their obligations and or prerogatives with respect to their young children? And what about pets? And what about, are you allowed to eat meat? There's all sorts of things. And, but are you allowed to torture a dog for fun? There's all kinds of things in there. Can you spank your kid? Can you enslave your child? There's all sorts of things going on in there that I think libertarian legal theory can use some help with. And let me just say at the outset, so we were joking, folks, beforehand. I said to Adam, I think this episode is going to be more Hayekian than Rothbardian. And what I meant is, I think Adam and I are going to say some useful things, and hopefully you folks will all agree that our streams of consciousness are informative. But at the end, I don't think we're going to have any answers for you. We're not going to have, you take these 3 principal points, and that's all you need, and go forth and generate law.
Yeah, that's a feature, not a bug, because the last time Rothbard tried it, he ended up with a starving child in a room and the parents being perfectly fine with just ignoring it and letting it starve to death.
Right. So that's kind of what we're doing. So let me just say at the outset, my approach to this stuff, Adam, is I don't like, what am I trying to say? There's 2 problems. So one is, like you say, is Rothbard, is I think where he had a viewpoint. He had some axioms and he had this logical deductive approach to it. And he ended up, he started out with the premise that you don't have positive obligations. So you're walking by someone drowning in the lake, maybe it's moral for you to render assistance, but legally speaking, you're a bystander. And no, it's not that you can get in legal trouble. No one else can use violence against you to compel you to render assistance to some stranger. Like if you pushed a guy in the lake, then you got to rescue him. But if you had nothing to do with it, then that's not your responsibility. And then likewise, when Rothbard's talking about children, he does have this infamous passage in the Ethics of Liberty where he concludes you can't, take a baseball bat and start beating your kid over the head with it. That would be murder. But if you got the toddler sitting in the high chair and you just refrain from feeding him, strictly speaking, that shouldn't be illegal because the law cannot compel you to give your resources to somebody else, right? So I think that's wrong. And so I'm recoiling from that. But on the other hand, I have not been satisfied with any other libertarians' writings on children because to me, it seems like they know what they want the answer to be. And they kind of just use weaselly arguments to get there and just kind of like, well, we know obviously it's got to look like such and such. And I don't think that works either. That certainly wouldn't be, grounds for guiding judges and rendering opinions on messy, edge cases where there's different principles competing with each other. If you don't have any kind of principles at stake, it can't just be, well, you got to look at the situation and just say, what does your gut tell you? Because then that's not really, conducive to legal precedent and so forth. So that's kind of my guideposts.
I totally agree with that approach, and we'll get into the details, but let's just dive right into that nub because that's critical. Because Rothbard was, as you said, building things up from we respect property rights and we use the non-aggression principle as our guide, and therefore it was anathema for him to conceive of anything like a positive right. And then he looked at this relationship between parent and child and was like, hey, I got no obligation here. You can't impose a positive right upon me by mere fact of your existence. And I think that's wrong. I think when you adopt the position of a guardian parent for something that is going to be human someday, assuming everything goes right, but isn't now, fully an adult with all human rights.
I was going to say, I think babies are humans.
Yeah, I misspoke. Sorry. But, yeah, I think that's not just, hey, I'm just sitting here and here's this 2-year-old and I don't know, I guess somebody should feed him, but I just don't feel like it. No, I think when you put yourself in that situation, you have taken on literally a positive obligation, but I'm not sure how to, I'm not libertarian theorist enough or legal theorist enough to figure out how we get there.
Right. Okay. So here, and folks, I'm going to be recycling, we'll put in the links, some previous things that I've done on this stuff, and I'll just be kind of working in some of my past thoughts on this. But I really looked forward, Adam, to talking with it, but because I think our crossover episodes is the perfect venue to flesh some of this stuff out. And hey, maybe somebody will go write a journal article based on this. If we can just save 10 lives, it'll be worth it. And so, yeah, on that, I think, and again, folks, notice with all this stuff, what I'm going to be trying to do is to come up with some legal issue that's the same kind of tension, but not in the context of parents and children, like just to make sure we're on solid footing to then apply it to this case. So there, I would say, and I didn't invent these, other people have said this, but it'd be like, if you have some resort vacation home that's on some island in the middle of the Pacific, and you invite a bunch of your friends out there, and then they all get out there, and then you just decide, you tell one of your friends, you know what, turned out I saw something you wrote in my yearbook years ago I didn't realize, and screw you. So I'm not going to kill you, but I'm not going to feed you, and I'm not going to provide you with transportation. And, and you kind of like kick him out, and now he's on the island on the sand, and you've locked him out of your mansion, and there's nothing he can do, and he's just going to starve to death or die of thirst or whatever out there because he doesn't have his phone on, or his phone has no reception. And he's like, I didn't kill him. I just refrained from. So I think in a case like that, or another one is you invite somebody up in your private plane, and then, up in the air, you tell the guy, you know what, I changed my mind, get off my property. I'm not saying what you got to do. I'm saying you got to go home. You just can't stay here. You're effectively killing him.
I didn't say you couldn't fly. You go right ahead.
Right. So in cases like that, you can see how that would be kind of ridiculous, and surely the legal system would not allow you to put somebody in such a position of being utterly dependent on you rendering assistance and support, otherwise they die, not because you literally murdered them, but because you just refrained from rendering assistance. So likewise, I would say whatever principles you want to use to explain how the law would treat the guy in those situations, I think, like as you're saying, Adam, likewise, if you are, the community thinks you're taking care of this 2-year-old, then, among other things, like clearly it would be incumbent upon you, like just to go back to those other examples. And you could say, well, no, I found out the guy was cheating with my wife, on me with my wife or something like that's. Are you kidding me? I don't want to, give him the steak dinner that I had prepared for all my guests. Still, okay, it's incumbent upon you to call the Coast Guard or something. You know what I mean? Like you have to allow for this guy to leave your island and return back without him dying of thirst or something. And so likewise, if you just decide, I don't want to take care of this 1-year-old anymore, you can't just let it die in your care. You have to like let the community know, hey, I don't want this kid anymore. You know what I mean? Like at the very least. So I think that's the way you could handle that. And you can see we're not building up the whole principle of legal theory just around the case of the 1-year-old kid.
Sure,
that's a broader idea.
Yeah, and the other side that we have to be careful of is when parents are the complete opposite of, yeah, I'm not saying the kid can't eat. I'm just not going to do it myself, and you can't make me. The other side of that is the parent that's too overprotective to the point of imprisoning the kid in the basement or something, or making a literal slave out of him. And it's funny because people, like, language is a bit of a problem here. The way we speak of children is they're our children. But that "our" is pointing to a relationship, not a property title.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because people just reflexively go to it. It's like, yeah, do you own your kid? You know, because of the language, they try to defend, like, maybe I do own my kid or something like that. But
did you see the argument I got in with the guy talking about intellectual property a couple of weeks ago on Twitter?
I'm a fan, Bob, but I'm not stalking you.
Okay, because it was so funny that I'll just tell the real quick version was. So this libertarian guy, but he believes in intellectual property. Am I right? and he was very confident in his position, and he was arguing against me and other people. Like, I kind of did a drive-by, and then he tried to suck me into the maelstrom, and he was saying stuff like, the very fact that you say the sentence, "I don't own my novel," shows, a performative contradiction, and it blows up your position. And so and other people were arguing with him, and he was like just rolling his eyes at, like, he thought they didn't get the deep point he was making and that they weren't familiar with argumentation. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
And so I said to the guy, "Do you own your father?"
Yeah, perfect.
And you would not believe, like, that just further convinced him of what an idiot I was. Like, I clearly didn't get his point. And anyway, it was just amazing, like, how many people like stopped arguing with him, just trying to explain to him very slowly, "Don't you see what Bob is saying to you?" And he refused to get it. It was amazing. And he just kept digging in deeper and deeper. Like, "I used to respect you, Murphy, but now I see what an idiot you. I can't even believe you don't get and it was just amazing." So yeah, there is that issue with that stuff. But what's funny is Rothbard in Ethics of Liberty, I mean, he actually says the parent owns, maybe he uses quotation marks, but he does use it, and he talks about a baby market and stuff. So he really kind of leads with his chin on a lot of that stuff, confirming, some of the crazy stereotypes that a leftist might have about, like, oh, what's a libertarian approach to child rights? Oh my gosh, these people. So, and in fairness, I don't want to mislead people. Rothbard does say, like, it's a, is it a dumbrated? I don't remember what kind of word he uses. Attenuated type of ownership.
Yes,
that like over time it phases out and whatever. You're more of like a trustee and blah blah. And he gets it, but still. And so let me just real quickly, I'll motivate this. Just have people give a commercial. I did an episode of the Bob Murphy Show on this stuff where my theory was, I kind of just arbitrarily said this as an idea, but I think it has a lot of neat properties. That what if the way we treat this is that as the guardian of a child, you are acting as the trustee on behalf of the trustor, but the trustor is the future version of the child, right? So the idea is that what you're supposed to be doing is managing the resources, including the child's literal body, on behalf of the person who sets up the trust, and knowing what the person's wishes were. And so you're not the owner, right? If you're a trustee managing resources, you're not the owner of those resources. It's not like you say, oh, you're kind of the owner but not fully. Like, that's not the way you talk, legally speaking. You're not the owner, you're the trustee. And my idea was, what if some rich guy sets up a trust, appoints a trustee, and he gives all these written instructions, like maybe it's like for a scholarship fund or something. People write essays on Austrian economics, and each year the top 5 winners get $10,000, blah, blah, blah. You got to manage a trust and certain investments that aren't too risky and all this kind of stuff. And then what if those documents get lost? And so now you got this pile of properties, assets sitting here. And then, I think they wouldn't just sit there, that like the legal framework would allow for it. Clearly, I thought, what would you do is say, well, let's try to administer this with our best guess as to what the original trustor wanted this to be like. And you could look at his speeches and things like that, or look at other trusts of a similar nature if you didn't have any idea. So likewise, I'm saying when you got a 6-month-old infant and you're the caretaker, you're acting on its behalf, or his or her behalf, to not be weird about it. And you're trying to anticipate, well, when they're a full-grown adult, legally speaking, then, what would they want me to do on their behalf right now? So in the beginning, you just got to make it. But as the kid gets older, you have a better idea. Like when the kid's 13, you got a better idea of when they're a legal, adult, what they would want you to do. Like, would you want to send them to boarding school or what, things like that. And so anyway, that was kind of the framework I had. And I thought it did satisfy a few nice principles involved. Just like if you saw somebody administering a trust and they were clearly violating the rules of it, like you just knew they were, like, what standing would you to go report to someone? So to me, that would be like if you saw a parent beating the crap out of his kid. Like at some point, we all know there must be some threshold at which the community can step in and say, no, you can't, like you're going to chop your kid's arm up. No, you can't do that. We're taking the kid away from you. But, whereas, maybe swatting them on the butt because they mouthed off to you, the community say, yeah, maybe some of us don't feel good about that, but, like we can't legally stop you. So that was to me to come up with, principles like that. And to me, looking at the legality of trusts and how those are administered and when can someone object and say, I don't like this trustee being in charge of this property. I thought that was like a framework that might be worth, shedding light by analogy.
I think that's a great framework. I think there's a lot of room to maneuver. It's very dynamic. It's very powerful. It sidesteps that nasty ownership conundrum. And it's really unfortunate that Rothbard kept using that word, because I would never frame it that way. But I do think that in a free society, you would have, I would never call it a baby market, but you would have people willing to, give up their role as, like, I believe the reason the parent is the initial trustee in this framework is pretty obvious. There's a genetic, component. The parents created literally the life of this person. No one else has a better claim to the trustee position for sure in that framework. But I do think that a lot of suffering would be alleviated if the government got out of the way and people, there would be moral, approbations about certain forms of these, baby markets. But in principle, the suffering gets alleviated when supply and demand, people don't necessarily want their kid. Rather than raise that kid in a loveless household, maybe they take a few $1,000s from a couple who really does want to raise that kid. I do think in a free society, these sorts of exchanges would happen. I hope they don't call them baby markets, but something. And what you're trading isn't an ownership stake. That is sort of barbaric, and that's not the relationship between parent and child. It's something closer to what you were elucidating, guardianship or the role of a trustee. And I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but I do think that you've outlined a very fuzzy framework, and what you would fill in the contours of that is like the norms and customs of the society that you're in. Like, what is normal for a parent to give a kid in the society? How best is a trustee to act in order to serve the best interests of the child once they become an adult? I think that you flesh that in with all the norms, customs, rituals, expectations in society. Like, it would obviously, you'd be breaking your contract if you didn't teach the kid to read or write or learn how to work a computer or something. And that's a positive obligation that Rothbard would shrink from. But again, it's because he was using a framework we all agree with, property rights plus non-aggression principle, but he backed himself into a corner because he framed the relationship between parent and child as a property claim. And I think that's just wrong.
Well, and also as if it's a property claim between two strangers.
Right.
When that's
like,
clearly
who are
not
you,
right. You know what I mean? And like, yeah, like, somebody's walking by, a truck drives by and some 2-year-old plops on your front lawn. And
how'd you get in my high chair?
Right. So even there, I'd say I still think you got to do something, like call somebody or something.
I would hope, yeah.
But still, yeah, the way Rothbard's loading the deck there, that just seemed amazing. And that's why I was going through, those examples. You invite people out to your island somewhere, you got to feed them. You can't just say, hey, sucks to be you.
And that's bigger than just a moral claim. I do believe it's a legal one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I know too, like there's like the law of the sea and stuff. You do have a duty to render assistance if you can. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you're out in the ocean and you see a ship in distress, you can't just keep steaming on by and be like, no, we got to get these cruise goers to port by this time, or else the cruise line's going to have my head. You can't. You have to stop and render it. So again, people can say, oh well, that's statist international law. That's okay, maybe, but I do think actually the law of the sea is kind of the product of what is libertarianish, common law rulings and things like that. That it's not just a bunch of bureaucrats got together in Brussels and laid out these bullet points as to how maritime interactions should unfold. To go back to your point again, folks, I don't want to be beating up on Rothbard too much. I mean, he does use like the trustee terminology, but he does say ownership, and he does talk about baby market. So yeah, it's funny, Adam, you mentioned that, because I wrote an article one time. I forget what website it was for, and I specifically, said in the article, it's not a baby, it's a market for parental rights. And the editor who first, webbed it up and sent me the link to proofread it before it went live, called it the principles for a baby market. And I was like, no. My whole point. And I felt a little bit squeamish, like, oh, am I just fooling myself? Like, really, am I talking about a baby market? And I don't want to call it that or something. But in any event, right. It was not that you were buying and selling the babies. You were buying and selling the right to be considered the legal guardian. And, and as you say, like just with all kinds of government prohibitions and stupid regulations, there's all sorts of backward consequences that right now, because it's very difficult to adopt children in the United States. You can't just pay, to get it done. Well, you got to do all these hoops and you got to prove to the agencies, blah, blah, blah. There's, I think, lots of kids that, end up growing in homes where, it's the kind of thing where if your parents would rather take $10,000 from some outsider to not be your parents anymore, is it good for the law to keep the kid with those parents? It's not obvious to me that that's the case, especially when you get into people like that have drug addiction and stuff. You can see how, nobody's saying it's a good situation, but it might be a lesser of two evils to let some outside couple that, is infertile write a check to, on a 100% reserve bank, of course, to, the mother who has access to all sorts of nice, cheap, safe drugs because it's a libertarian society, and, send the kid over that way. Right. So
a whole bunch of these cases are going to be really, really murky and hard to get at the facts of them. But it doesn't mean that a libertarian society would just try and wash their hands of them. Before we leave Rothbard, I want to take a few jabs at the poor genius who can't, not here to defend himself. I think he tied himself up in knots because of that ownership thing and shying away from anything close to a positive right. I think that was part of the problem. But also, when you look at the cases he was citing, it seemed like he had a bias that he really wanted to make sure. He says it directly. As soon as the child can demonstrate, he doesn't use these words, but demonstrate the preference by running away, he should be emancipated. At any age, he made a point of stressing that, and that's obviously nuts. But I think, again, referencing the cases he cited, and maybe it was how he perceived the world in New York at that time, I think he was just really, really worried about the problem of abusive parents and a kid not being able to get away. Mm-hmm. And so he really shaded his analysis away, trying to deal with that problem, such that the 5-year-old says he wants to live with somebody, the guy in the van down by the river, and who are we to say no?
Yep. Yeah. So just to give, and by the way, let me just say before I forget, I think some of this, I realize how patronizing this must sound, but I think it's true. Rothbard didn't have kids. Right. And I think for some of these things, it's like, no, dude, you got to understand. Like my 5-year-old is extremely intelligent, but he doesn't know anything. Like he's got nutty views about how the world works and stuff. So anyway, it's like, the other day he thinks that my mom is stronger than my brother. And I'm like, no, Uncle so-and-so can really, crush grandma. What are you talking about? So anyway, one principle, right? So for people who don't understand that, besides the infamous passages Rothbard has, where if the kid's sitting in the high chair in the kitchen, you don't have an obligation to feed them. Besides that, yeah, Rothbard he's talking about the rights of the kid or whatever, and when can the kid run away? And Rothbard says, when can the kid just be emancipated from the parents or whatever? And Rothbard says when the kid demonstrates his autonomy by, quote, running away. I think he's got running away in quotation marks.
When the child demonstrates them in nature by running away regardless of age.
That's the exact quote?
Yeah.
You got that in front of you? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm glad you looked that up because I was going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say, I don't know if he just remained agnostic on the age, but no, he says regardless of the age. That's actual the quote in there?
I went ahead and read the man in his own words.
There you go. You got the physical. But what was that thing you were holding up? I didn't.
Yeah, back in the olden days, there's something called paper.
That's interesting. That's like, was it written in Morse code? So you can see there, folks. Yeah, I'm glad that Adam, you got that because I wasn't sure if he spelled that. So clearly, again, you understand what Rothbard's trying to get. He wants to provide that. There's different competing issues at play here.
Yeah,
and one of them is, some father's sleeping with his daughter. I mean, just to be graphic about it, clearly she shouldn't have to sit there and deal with that, right? That should legally should end, and she should have some escape hatch. But on the other hand, like Adam's saying, 6-year-old says, "I hate you. I don't want to stay here because you said you can't eat candy for dinner." And then some guy down the street says, "Hey, I'll be your daddy. You can have Snickers every night for dinner." And the kid signs some paper saying, "Yes, I'm of sound mind and body, and I agree." Blah blah blah. We just really didn't know. That's crazy. You can't do that. And I think somebody who had kids would know that's nutty. And so here, but again, I want to stress, just to go back to my earlier, principles. It's not that I'm just saying, well, that's crazy. If you had kids, move on next. The principle I want to give for this is to say there's situations when you can't legally give consent. And so, example I use a lot is if you're hammered in the bar and you're playing darts and you say to the guy, "Oh, okay, one more game, winner gets the other guy's house." And you take out a cocktail napkin and sign it. I could understand. I said this one time and then somebody told me, "No, there's a famous legal case where that did happen." And okay. But I can understand if a judge in a libertarian society, some guy goes in the next day with the cocktail napkin and says, "Yeah, I own Frank's house now because I beat him in dart." And we were, I could see the judge saying, "I'm not going to consider that a legally binding contract." Okay, because he was not of sound mind. He didn't realize what he was agreeing to when he said that to you and signed his name on that cocktail napkin. So likewise, a 6-year-old cannot understand what it is he's agreeing to if he says, "Yeah, I'm going to go live with you in your van and be your kid from now on." Like he's not in a position to make that decision over his future. So, and again, like that goes into the trustee, thing as well, that it totally makes sense that you could be the trustee administering resources on behalf of the beneficiary, with the theory being the beneficiary is not yet mature enough to understand, how to use them properly. That's why you don't just hand over the trust fund to the kid when he's 13.
I want to get into how standing would be created in a Rothbardian society, but your dart story reminded me of a funny story, if you don't mind a brief tangent.
I do not mind.
A buddy of mine told me this last night. He said he used to play poker in college in Italian class. Apparently, they weren't teaching Italian in Italian class. They were just letting the kids play poker.
I assumed you meant like in the back of the room, like unbeknownst. You're saying that the teacher knew they're also.
Oh no, I don't know any of the details, but yeah, I'm sure the teacher wasn't actually there, or maybe it was just had a head in the book. I don't know. I don't know the details. Anyway, my buddy used to play cards in Italian class, and at the end, instead of settling up with his buddy, one of his buddies, the guy didn't have any money, and so they decided to flip. It's not flipping a coin, but it's effectively the same thing. We'll just flip for it, double or nothing, with the idea that he'd be giving this buddy a break, I think. And when the guy gets to nothing, they'll walk away and nobody owes anybody anything.
Mm.
And my buddy
flip meaning flip card, like high card. Is that what that means?
Similar to high card. He'd actually deal out a bunch of cards and see who ends up with the best low ball hand or high hand or whatever. But it effectively, for the reader or for the listeners, it's just flipping a coin because there's no skill involved. It's just who gets lucky. So my buddy proceeds to win like 15 or 20 or something ridiculous number of flips in a row, to the point where his buddy now owes him like $2.5 million or something. And obviously he never collected on any of that. It's not quite as ludicrous as the guy super drunk playing darts for the deed to his house, but it does go to show that in norm and custom, there are some debts that are just uncollectible, and it's so ridiculous. Okay, you start mailing in those payments. Maybe by the time your grandkids can eventually pay off this debt.
Have I told you this story where we were really into gambling when I was in high school, and I got a poster board out, and we obviously did all kinds of permutations of card games, but we wanted more, so I got out a poster board and I did some dice games. I somehow came up with like rules, payoffs, and things like that to make it look official, and that I had slots where you could place your chips, on the thing before you roll the dice, just to kind of make it more official than us just keeping track of it in our head. And my buddy one time, he got like in this OCD thing where he just kept picking the dice up and just kept throwing. And I like every 5 rolls, I would physically grab his arms and make him look and lock eyes with me and say, "You understand? You right now owe me, $230, right? This is real money, right? You agree? Say out loud, this is real money, And then he would just keep it. Oh, no more, again. And he's just and likewise, it was. I think we ended up. I let him pay me like 20 cents of the dollar or something. We both felt good about it, that I made a bunch of money and he didn't owe me $1,000 or something. But it was a similar kind of thing where I kept stopping him to say, "This is real. You understand that, right?" And we agree.
Gambling can be addictive, boys and girls. Tread carefully. So anyway, back to the kids. Like in a statist society, either the girl would run to Child Protective Services, or someone would report the situation, and the state would get involved, and the courts and family, all that stuff. But in a free society, how would standing be regulated? Could anybody step in and volunteer to take over the trustee job? Would the child have a choice? Would the family relation, like a grandma or an aunt, would they have a preferable pecking order, place in line? Or would there be institutions with, each one would have a list of vetted couples who are interested in taking care of kids, or, an orphanage or something? How do you think that would arise if the state wasn't putting its monopolistic thumb all over the scale and screwing everything up?
Right. So here, let me just, go ahead again and double click on my earlier idea. And this is one of the implications of it that I thought was nice, that I could give you a crisp answer to that question. Maybe it's a wrong answer, but it wasn't just me making something up. And again, so the argument I used was, suppose that the way the libertarian legal framework treats children is, it's as if the guardian is a trustee administering the trust on behalf of the trust. It's the trustor, I think, is the one that establishes the trust.
Yes.
But in this case, the trustor is the future version of the kid.
Yep.
Right. And again, we don't quite know what the wishes of the trustor were. And the analogy would be like, what if the founding documents were just literally lost in a fire or something, and the guy's dead, and you don't know, he set up this foundation and we don't know how to administer it. And so that was the idea. And so to say, at what point can the law step in and do something? And I said, okay, well, let's not solve it with the hard problem of children, just in general. Somebody, is a trustee that's administering some foundation on behalf of the trustor who's dead, and there's a beneficiary who's in a coma, right? So we have no idea what the beneficiary, role is here. And then some outside party thinks the trustee is mismanaging the funds, and like, oh, wow, they're putting them in investments that are really speculative, and they got it, 97% in Bitcoin. Ooh, that seems kind of risky, and I don't think the trustor. And that, and you could get real specific, if it's a clear-cut example where, no, we have the documents and it clearly said a 10% allocation to crypto tops, well, then it's clearly, violent. But what if we didn't have that? So I'm just saying things like that, and then who would be allowed to do that? So I do think somebody who knows the beneficiary would be in a better position to make a case to the court that I don't think that this is being done in the spirit of what the whole point of the trust was.
Or if, like, the person in the coma was a member of the Audubon Society, and the trustee is investing all their funds in, drilling for oil in really vulnerable places.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So and that's the kind of thing. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up. So in my story, that is why that it could be like, I don't mean to be graphic, but stuff like, should kids get circumcised or whatever? Well, I think part of it would be cultural, that if it really is a culture where every male would be absolutely horrible. Like imagine if it was like ancient Israel and you knew if you get to be 20 years old and that hasn't been done to you, that people will think something's off. You would have wanted, you know what I mean? Like you'd be horrified at your parents. Why didn't you do that?
Sure.
Whereas in a different kind of society, you'd say that. So anyway, I'm just saying you could see things like girls getting their ears pierced, if that's considered completely normal. And you could see that, no, I think statistically speaking that, the women in this society, they don't think that's weird and so on. Whereas, the girl wants to chop her hand off or something because, I think I really wanted, like you could see the people not letting her do that or whatever. So anyway, I'm just saying there is all that interplay, and that's why it is culturally dependent, and we're not engaging in moral relativism, I don't think. It's, the moral principles apply, but it's just that, you got to fill them in with some specifics. And so, the way I'm just my long way of coming back to your question, Ed, is I think I would want to first know, and I don't know, but specifically, it just in a financial context, somebody is administering a trust on behalf of somebody else. And then what outsiders are allowed, could you go to the court and say, hey, I don't think this guy is adhering to, the conditions that the trustor established. And then, who's allowed to make that case. And notice, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have to be a relative. It could be anybody.
No, it could be anybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it would be the sort of situation where you might even have organizations set up to be a trustee in cases where, something horrible's happened and the kid's got to get away. But an objection popped into my head that somebody else might think of out there in listener land. So I had to bring it up so we can deal with it. And it is that there is a situation rife for abuse now in our society in which you get really corrupt fraudsters making a sort of a deal with a psychologist or a doctor to get old people committed to be as a child, unable to handle their to the point where they need a caretaker, an official caretaker. Mm-hmm. And then these lawyers usually will go to a judge and file a writ and get all their assets placed under their trusteeship, and then they'll take care of the person as if they were, acting in their own best interest, and it turns into this just theft. Mm-hmm. So right off the top of my mind, all I'll say is that when monopolists are in charge, you don't have good mechanisms for fixing, coercion and fraud and stuff like that. There's no competition in the system. It's also good that in the case of children, they do grow up, fairly quickly, whereas someone who's old and becomes incompetent, there's they don't turn into 18-year-olds. They go the other way.
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up, that, that possible abuse, but your answer is the one I would have given, to say, that's an issue, but the best way to combat that is to have competing, judicial frameworks. And it's not that, there's just that one judge is in charge of all the such cases in this region. And if that judge happens to be lax or corrupt, well, it sucks to be an old person in that jurisdiction. Like that, right. No, that if clearly like judges could advertise and they could say, whoa, look at these cases over here from this guy. And you don't want, the community shouldn't trust his judgments anymore about who should have their, property taken over. So I think there's that element.
And the bad actors, including the judges in a free society, would be liable as well. They wouldn't just be declared immune from prosecution just because, hey, I was just working within the system and we're following the regulations, and mistakes happen.
Sure. I mean, depending on how egregious, but I'm saying at the very least, their carnage could be contained, that they would lose business like that.
Right.
Again, it's just for people who aren't familiar. My framework, judges have to compete for business. Like the customers have to come to them. Like people are getting, an employer and employer having a contractual dispute, and they agree to take the matter to a judge. They both agree to that judge beforehand and say, yes, we agree to abide by this judge's rulings, with the right to appeal and blah, blah, blah built into the contract. And, and why would they do that? Well, because they need to come up with some resolution. It doesn't do anybody any good to have this issue locked up, and that judge has a reputation for fairness. So at the very least, some judge starts making dubious rulings, even if it's not quite demonstrably criminal what he's doing, he's going to rapidly lose business. And so that's what I'm saying. Like at least the problem can be minimized and contained. Whereas, now, if a judge is corrupt and doing something, there's got to be a whole sting operation, and you got to get some other faction of the government to go prosecute the guy. And, so But the flip side too, or a different type of thing that I just want to make sure our listeners are aware of, because I've heard people say things like, "Oh yeah, I kind of like your libertarianism for adults, but when it comes to kids, I just know libertarian doesn't work at all." Even if they don't know about Rothbard's dubious passage, but just in general, they're going to say, "No, you need the state to come in and rescue these kids from abusive households." But I say, "Oh, okay, that sounds great, nice in theory, but are you aware of just the horrific stuff that happens like in the state's foster care system?"
Mm-hmm.
Real cases of foster parents who are systematically abusing and or like renting the kids out and stuff like that. Like that happens.
The best case is that they think that they'll make out financially by taking the whatever it is, $800 a month, and spending less than that, and it turns into a moneymaker. And yeah, it's like people who advocate for the state to solve these people, you want to get up really close to them and just say, "Have you met the state?"
Right. Yeah. So anyway, that for all the reasons that, if you're someone who, I'm a libertarian when it comes to adults, right? And because you realize, the state starts unnecessary wars and the police are, unnecessarily violent with suspects and blah, 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 and all these other things. And they destroy the inner city with all their welfare program. Okay, good. And then, do you really think that institution is, going to really make sure that, some kids are being harmed by what we're doing? I mean, look at the public schools. Right? Do you really think the state, the people running it, just lose sleep at night worrying about how do we best promote the welfare of children? And I'm just saying, stuff I would not have believed was possible when I was 20, in the reading libertarian stuff about what actually happens in foster care systems in this country. And again, this isn't like in the movie Taken and something that happens in Saudi Arabia. We're talking about in the United States, documented cases.
I don't think we want to delve too deeply into the article you shared with me by Walter Block and a couple of his co-authors, where they were sort of going over this principle in Rothbard and trying to clean it up a little bit and underline it. But there was a paragraph that I just found so weird. I feel like I have to read it to you and see what you think.
Okay.
So they're trying to bolster Rothbard's claim that the child has the agency to exert their will in nature, or whatever the phrase was, and run away, and we should honor the will of the child. so this paragraph, I'm going to butcher these names, but these are scientists of some kind. Belargian, Spelke, and Wasserman propose that infants have the ability to understand principles of physics and relations of cause and effect. Children may be less egocentric and better able to understand the world than many commentators previously gave them credit for. Gopnik and Repiccioli contend that by the age of 18 months, Bob, infants have acquired the ability to determine others' preferences based on facial expressions. Recent advancements in child psychology suggest that youngsters are indeed able to, quote, select and pursue their ends, unquote, thus making them homesteaders of their own bodies, legal adults, by the standard Rothbard sets out. Now, half of me says, okay, this is people in grad school just trying to add a little bit of academia stuff, add some knowledge into a paper to make sure they're contributing something to the field. But another part of me says, yeah, that's just nuts. What do you mean understand physics and gain agency and ownership at 18 months? I mean, we've been talking about, yes, when as the kids mature, they slowly get closer and closer to becoming an adult. That's not, you don't flip a switch. That's why at 13, a child is much easier time. You have a much easier time figuring out what the wishes of that adult child are going to be at 13 than at 13 months. But it just seems like this paper was trying to really make a weird claim to underscore what Rothbard was saying, that, the 2-year-old walked away and now they're emancipated.
Yeah. So they're, I have read that paper, but I didn't have time to reread it again before we recorded here this time, Adam. I'm guessing from what you read that they're trying to show, like, so this is why, hey, we're not just being arbitrary here. We're grounding this in standard libertarian principles and homesteading that Rothbard agrees with, and that's why the parent can't chop the kid's arm off and go sell it to somebody else. Like, no, because the kid owns his body.
Yeah.
But my problem with the way they're trying to do it there is like twofold. On the one hand, okay, but are you saying the newborn infant doesn't own his body, and so therefore you could chop off, you could take the kidney out of the newborn's body and give it to somebody and sell it because, well, the newborn actually hasn't yet fully figured out how to control his body. So we wouldn't say that, right? So there's that element, but also,
Yeah,
like
but I don't think we would need to invoke that in order to make cutting his kidneys out wrong.
Well, that's my point. That whatever they think they're doing with that paragraph, I'm saying either doesn't do enough or it does too much.
Right.
But it's not Goldilocks, that's for sure. So that's what I'm saying. I think they're trying to show, oh no, we can come up with a reason, grounded in standard libertarianism, homesteading theory, why the kid, you can't do something nutty to the kid. But like you just said, my point is, well, we better have other principles at our disposal because that doesn't protect the kid when he's a newborn. Is my point.
Totally.
Or like you said, if it does, well, then you got to be so open-ended that means that the 18-month-old can just crawl away and the parents can't physically stop him because that would be kidnapping or imprisonment. Exactly. You put him in a playpen? I mean, that's a cage. What are you doing? That's slavery. You can't do that.
Don't be laying hands on me, yo.
Yeah. And also, too, literally my 2-year-old, I use my superior physical. I mean, the kid lately, he doesn't want me changing his diapers. Like, he smacks me in the face and like, I have to hold him down. You know what I mean? Like, if I take my eyes and I go to grab the other diaper, like he's turning around and trying to scurry away and I have to, hold him down. And it's against his will. I'm forcing him, I don't cause him bodily injury, but if I were doing that to an 18-year-old person, for one thing, I wouldn't be able to unless he was a weakling, but it would be a crime. Like you're not allowed to do that to somebody what you can do it to your kid. And again, the answer is, I think when he's a grown up and I tell him what happened, he would say, yeah, thanks for changing my poopy diaper. I'm glad you did that. Thanks.
Yeah. To give the writers of this paper due credit, right after that paragraph that I thought was so funny, they talk about having professionals, counselors, sociologists, judges, other people that are wise in the ways of these things would look at the situation and evaluate it. It's not like he would take the word of the child or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, they were trying to bolster Rothbard's position in reason and not just crazy land.
Yep. So are you okay if we move away from the kids at this point?
I am.
Okay, so two areas where I think this could be applied, animals like we talked about, but also this is going to become more and more relevant is like robots.
Sure.
Like, people, especially men, are going to have robot girlfriends and stuff. And at some point, there's going to be legitimate questions about, are you legally allowed to do that? So,
let me,
I don't know how graphic you want to get in this episode, but I'm just saying this kind of stuff is going to come up.
It probably already has. We just don't know about it. Before we get to animals, I'll just remind everybody what Rothbard's position was, and that is that natural rights, human rights, are appropriate for our species on this planet as far as we know, and none other. Nature is red in tooth and claw, and I think his punctuating line is, we will recognize the rights of animals when they petition for them.
Yep.
So, a wolf is going to rip your throat out, no matter what. You can't reason with them. You can't sign a contract. They're a completely different species. But if we were to run across Martians or other space aliens from Star Trek and they were rational and reasonable and we could communicate with them, then it would be conceivable to treat them like they had natural rights too. And as Elon and OpenAI are trying to prove right now, they're trying to create those robots that are going to be just as sentient as we are if their dreams reach fruition. And so taking all that off the table, how should we treat all the rest of the animals on this planet? I mean, is that just shut the door? We own them. We own our pets and all our livestock in a way that we do not own our children. Do we owe anything to them?
Right. So what I would propose is one fruitful avenue. Like if I were a judge or if I were a consultant and some judges came to me in the Libertarian Society, that kind of thing. I think what I would like to see is somebody write up a framework that explained, the principles by which out of that system popped the result that human beings, at least ones that aren't comatose and have, you know, an IQ above 60 and whatever, do have full legal rights when they're adults. You know, like that. You know, we didn't just assume that from the outset. We didn't just say, well, humans have rights because they're human. Like if you had some kind of, you know, more neutral framework that popped out, and then we could then test other cases and say, okay, well, that framework that says, you know, the prototypical case of a Homo sapien, you know, adult, whatever, it has legal standing and you can't do things to it. You can't own it and whatever. Then you could say, all right, well, what about a cow? And what? Oh, no, because of these reasons, you can own a cow. That's fine. You're not, you know, that's not slavery. And, you know, okay, well, what about a robot that says, you know, I have feelings, I have, you know, intentionality and da. And then, you know, what happens there? Like if it really is, like you wouldn't say if I just recorded that message and put it on my phone and you played the voice memo, we wouldn't all just jump away and go, oh my gosh, this phone has rights now, you know, and it's alive. Like you say, no, that's just a recording, some human program. You know what I mean? So we got to not just be naive and ridiculous about it, but like you're saying, from Star Trek: The Next Generation, if something acted the way that Data in that show acts, I'm pretty sure the judges are going to say, I think we can't, you know, enslave that creature. For one thing, wouldn't want to be the guy given the task of enslaving Data, but you get the point. Luck. So anyway, that's what I would want is like some kind of frame. So here, I'm not saying, Adam, I'm going to be able to give it to you, but that's the kind of thing and so along those lines, like you're saying, I think part of it would be, you know, aided by, you know, Mises' writings about, you know, the Ricardian law of association. It's like there are some sort of consequentialist utilitarian reasons. It's not good besides just abstract moral injunctions to that enslaving other people is not good. And certainly it's not a universalizable rule that we're all worse off if we live in a world where it's okay to enslave people. And so, you know, I think you could go through that. And then, so at the very least, if the robots get to the point of sophistication where it's like, yeah, even though the Acme company cranks these things out or whatever, they're going to just be more productive if we just let them choose where they get to work and we have to offer them contracts. It's not just like they come out and then they're the property of that company and they can rent them out. And you know what I mean? And they're the slaves of that company. That it's just, you know, just for the same reason that I would say, I think in a free market, even if it somehow started out with the existence of human slavery, that would have withered away, that there would have been manumission and just market incentives. You wouldn't have needed the Civil War, that eventually, if there really weren't government intervention in that market, the slaves would have bought their own freedom. So I think likewise, even if the legal default was the Acme Corporation cranks out these robots that really do have human levels of skills and they're, you know, physically strong and whatever, I don't think they would remain slaves forever. I think they would at the very least buy out their freedom.
Yeah, I don't think we'd have that much problem in society if they were obviously sentient. I think 99% of humanity would think about it just the same way you have, programmed as we are by 100 years of science fiction, and Data is the best character on there. And so, yeah, when you get to sentience, I think we don't have a problem, but pets are tricky. Like, I do think it is the case. You know, I own my cats and I am imprisoning them. I don't let them roam free because I think it's bad for them and they're going to get hurt out there. But, you know, if I'm walking along my neighborhood here, I see one neighbor tending his lawn, and that's great. I wave. I see another neighbor there pruning his hedges, and I wave at him. And then the next neighbor, he's got a whole bunch of puppies on the lawn. Oh, and my neighbor's Anthony Fauci, and he's doing something unspeakable to them. You know, I can easily imagine a situation where, yeah, this guy's just interacting with his property on his property, and what am I got to say about it? Except I want to bash him over the head and save those kittens and then torture him for the next 18 months. And
hey, I am the science. I am the science.
And I prefer when my legal theory lines up a little bit with my intuitions, but they just don't here. And I don't know what to do about that.
Right. So I'm glad you framed it like that, we don't have, and you could even have said that, you know, you're grilling steaks on the grill.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have been like, oh, what did you just do, you monster? You know,
that is how vegetarians or vegans real hardcore. Right. That's how you think about that.
Yeah. And let me say, like, go it this way. I can when we read historical accounts and you think like, man, there were a bunch of people walking around back in the day when, slavery was a thing, and how come they didn't? And I wonder, are people, in 100 years going to look back and be like, yeah, Adam and Bob, what the hell? You seem like you were decent moral guys, but you didn't have a problem with, do you know what was happening with factory farming and stuff, so yeah, I'm self-aware enough to say that, yeah, and for me, just as a Christian, I'm gonna say, well, Jesus ate meat, so
our species, our species eats meat, but I do have to say I'm bothered enough by it that if they do figure out how to make, meat in a lab and it's as good as a ribeye, I will switch, just because I don't like the thought of how my food gets to me.
Yeah,
I'm not going to quit. Vegetarians look very anemic to me and sickly, and my body needs protein, and tofu ain't going to do it. But I am bothered. I don't like to think of hurting these poor defenseless animals to get my bacon, which I will have every morning. Sorry, but I am bothered.
Oh, those cattle are not defenseless. You're toe to toe. So yeah, and again, folks, we're laying out the groundwork. So, I mean, I'm just saying some obvious things here. I think part of the issue is that there really is a distinction that if there were a culture where they needed to eat dogs for sustenance,
it's called South Korea, Bob.
Yeah, I could see, that not being a thing, and if those Haitian immigrants really did need to eat the neighbor's cat or dog or whatever the allegation was, that
they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats.
You could understand how, if that really were a cultural thing, you say, no, that's, I don't look down upon you the way I would look down at my next door neighbor if I caught him,
social norms.
Dog. Yeah.
Like 1,000 years ago, you and I come to them and bring up this conversation, they're just going to laugh themselves silly about it. What are you talking about? Most of us starve here. We have a problem. We don't have the too much abundance of food problem. So maybe.
Well, and also they'd say, what do you mean? What's wrong with slavery? What are you talking about? You mean like manual labor? Because to them, that's what it would be. Like, yeah, some people are manual laborers. What is this slavery term you're using?
It does go to show that as we get more affluent, it's like that old environmentalism thing. First you get rich and you're not worried about starving, and then you start worrying about the cleanliness of the streams and everything else. And maybe how we deal with the animals that are close to us, it'll be just one more thing that technology and abundance makes us change our whole cultural norms over. I can easily see that happening.
Yeah. So, let me just give the easy answers, like, for some of this stuff. In a free society with cultural norms similar to ours, except they don't like coercion. You could have all sorts of stuff like the neighborhood rules.
Sure.
Just like you can't play loud music past 10 p.m. and blah blah blah. And you can't torture your puppy. That, like, you just can't do that.
Would they write out all those restrictions, or would they just say no Haitians and just keep it simple like that?
It's the Dave Smith HOA.
That's right.
So, so again, like, I'm saying with this stuff, but, and in one sense that's a cop out, but the other, I do want to just say that, hey, there's ways that free society can deal with this stuff. True. If we're, getting all tied up in knots, it's not that you need to, from first principles, necessarily bang out the entire list of things. So yeah, if it's a kind of thing where 99.9% of us agree, I can't articulate exactly why, but it seems all right to me to slaughter chickens and turkeys. You're not allowed to slaughter house cats and puppies. You just can't, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah,
there's a way you could make that pop out of the system, even if you're a legal owner.
It's hardly an insurmountable problem. My HOA gives me 4 colors of beige that I'm allowed to paint my house. I think they could find a way to restrict me from filleting and grilling my puppy on the front lawn. I think we can set up rules like that if we really do not want that in our society.
But but even there too, it's interesting. Could you say more? Again, I would just, where I'm going with this stuff like animal cruelty, and like even in a situation where, these chickens, we're going to slaughter them for, or we're taking their eggs and, we're like stealing their children or whatever, there's like, like if you start analyzing it, it does look kind of creepy. But even there, you still could say, oh, but there still should be some norms. You know what I mean? Like there's a humane way to have a dairy farm and things like that. And so how would that be, quote, regulated in, a libertarian society? And would that all just become from the law, or would it just merely be market forces and things like, so like I said, at the very least, even if the basic underlying legal framework was agnostic to that stuff, if the community felt strongly enough about it, and I think they would, you could have certification organizations that would go around and say, yeah, we have spot unannounced inspections of these places, and only buy eggs that have this stamp of approval and blah, 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 because we go and we ensure that, whatever. So there would be that stuff. And that stuff I think would be better policed. Whereas now, like they have analogs of those things now, but I don't trust them as much. But I partly think that's just because the government is so awful at the basic law enforcement that, people are allowed to lie and do all sorts of things, and it's not prosecuted. Whereas I think in a society that really had more of the rule of law,
the government has crowded out the role of inspection and enforcement to the point where they're not doing the job, and they've made it so that nobody can do the job. You're absolutely right.
Right. And also those certificate like free range chickens and blah, 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 and all that stuff. I don't trust that, because I also think that, like, right now, if somebody tried to sue them for fraud, it wouldn't, I'm sure that those groups would pay off somebody at the Department of Agriculture. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not just that the government takes over the role of food safety inspection. I'm saying even these private certification organizations, I don't trust them, or like, the Made in USA labels or whatever. So, and I think that's because the government doesn't do its job of rooting out fraud. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And besides the point, in the case of these chickens, I mean, these are terrorists. They just peck us to death and ruin our civilization, Bob. Whose side are you on? These radical extremist chickens or us nice humans? Come on, Bob.
There was, when I was an undergrad, so I was living with these two guys, and then there were these two girls that were roommates, like that lived like two houses down from us. And there was a bit of rivalry, and, there was young attraction going on and whatever, fueling all this stuff. And so they got into a prank war with each other. As you can imagine, I'm usually Switzerland in these things, so I was largely out of it. And then someday in person, Adam, I'll tell you what happened. They one time did a prank that involved me, like it was unavoidable that I would be a victim of it. And so then I retaliated in a way that my roommates could not have conceived of, and I'll tell you that off air sometime. But reels. Yeah, but one time what happened was, this is back when I was an atheist and I was more uninhibited. But anyway, so one of the pranks that my roommates pulled on them was they went down to the farmer's market and got a chicken. I don't know what gender it was, and I don't know how identified. And they just, they kept it in the basement, and it just pooped its brains out. And then they just took that, and they kept dumping that on their porch or something. And it was just like an endless stream or so. Anyway, that was, they are vicious little creatures.
Well, just like all of our episodes, Bob, we end up in the same place. Chicken poop. I think this is good. I don't think we solved too much on the animal front, but I really do think that trustee, trustor, beneficiary framework, rather than some sort of a weird attenuated ownership principle, is the right way to think about the relationship between a child who was not yet a fully grown adult but will be, and their guardian. So kudos on
well,
that.
Thank you.
That's great.
I did. Sorry, I had one other possible angle on this stuff. Is it occurred to me, we talk about homesteading and, and we have all those principles, and I think those are largely correct. But it's at that first stage, like, we wouldn't say, oh, we got to this stream and it turned out these beavers homesteaded it. And so, now no human can own that stream because they clearly, they built a dam. Like that just wouldn't even occur to Rothbard or Haman to talk like that. Right. And so I'm saying, besides just saying, well, come on, it's a beaver. Like to actually give a rationale. And that was, if you remember, Adam, when Gene Callahan and I wrote our critique of Hans Hoppe's argumentation ethics, that was one angle that we took, was we could say, all right, well, because there was nothing intrinsic to his argument that limited it to humans. And I was like, okay, well then how come an animal rights activist couldn't read Hoppe's essay and just say, Eureka, This is why, you would be contradicting yourself if you said to a cow, you don't own yourself. The very fact that you uttered those words, you know what I mean? So clearly, Hoppe would say, well, no, it doesn't. If an animal sits there, it can't just be that, well, no, because the cow can't say that. Well, okay, so you're saying a human before they can talk, or if they're in a coma, they don't have rights now because they can't argue it. So anyway,
damn it, Bob! If you and I and every other bacon-eating human get thrown into some UN prison in Europe because of your argument, I'm going to be so mad at you.
I know.
As we sit together in the gulag, I'm going to hold a grudge.
Yeah. So all of that was to say, I think if you spelled out what type of being has the standing to be able to homestead, like that would shed light on, okay, so then what kind of being owns, like, because then you could homestead your its own body, and then that might shed light on, okay, so that Android, is that really just the property of Google, or is that a self-owner and Elon Musk can't own that thing, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. All right, have we run this thing to ground?
I think so.
All right, Bob. This was wonderful as always, and ladies and gentlemen, we run these shows both on Bob's platform, bobmurphyshow.com, and also at hamannature.com, and my YouTube channel, Haman Nature, Haman. Please use quotes or you get a funny Michael Jackson video. Thank you again, Bob, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everybody.